All right. We're looking at our 8th lesson now on the flood. Lesson 8, chapter 3, part 3. Now, this will be on logic. We have a few of the logical arguments that deal with the flood, but some of them deal with atheism in general. So be aware of that, okay? Many of the arguments advanced by atheists are fallacious. And we're going to, in this outline, I'm going to consider several common fallacies. Now, we had this last week, we had some fallacy. We had denying the antecedent as one of the fallacies. And so we're going to look at now a fallacy. Let's go back and redefine what a fallacy is any argument that seems conclusive to the normal mind, but that proves upon examination, that is further examination, not to establish the alleged conclusion. So it looks good on the surface, but when you dig into it, it's not good. Put it in simple terms. Okay. There's non sequitur fallacies, and these are kind of a generic term. But we'll look at some formal fallacies in induction or deduction. We're going to be limited to the deductive fallacy of affirming the consequent and a couple of other fallacies that we'll throw in with it as well. But most of the lesson will be on that fallacy right here, affirming the consequent. Now, let me lay out for you in the form of an argument, the fallacy of affirming the consequent has this. Here's an example of it. We take this argument. If Joe is a citizen of Texas, then Joe is a citizen of the United States. Now, I chose the word Joe because Joe is a short name to make it easy to get on my slides. So if you know someone named Joe, I'm not picking on them. It's just that's a short name. Okay. I could have put Sue or something like that, S-U-E, but Joe. So Joe is a citizen of Texas. That is called the antecedent, A-N-T-E-C-E-D-E-N-T. Ante, A-N-T-E, is Latin for before. So this goes before the word then, and the antecedent. Last week, we looked at an argument where they denied the antecedent and claimed they were disproving the consequent. This Joe, as a citizen of the United States, is the consequent. So here's your antecedent, here's your consequent. So right here, if we deny the antecedent, that doesn't prove anything about the consequent, right? Joe is a citizen of Texas, says in the United States. That's true. But, there's more ways to be a citizen of the United States than to be a citizen of Texas. You can be a citizen of Iowa, or Ohio, or New York, California, or whatever, and that'll make you a citizen of the United States. So there are other ways to do it. So if you're not a citizen of Texas, that doesn't tell whether you're a citizen of the United States or not. However, if I take this argument and I deny the consequent, that's called modus tollens, and that's the Latin for the denying of the consequent. What we have here, modus tollens, Joe is not a citizen of the United States. If I say that and I prove it, then I prove he's not a citizen of Texas, because all citizens of Texas are citizens of the United States. And so if you're not a citizen of the United States, you're automatically not a citizen of Texas. So that's valid to deny the consequent. But you see, if I affirm the consequent, Joe is a citizen of the United States, then that doesn't prove that he's a citizen of Texas. Why? Well, citizens of Oklahoma are citizens of the United States, and they're not citizens of Texas. See? So I can't affirm the consequent and prove the antecedent to be true. In a valid and a sound argument, the antecedent here, and right here, this your antecedent. I'm dragging across it back and forth. I can't highlight it because it'll advance the slide. But I'm dragging it across. That's your antecedent. It's a sufficient condition. In other words, if this is true, then the consequent is automatically true. That has to be the case if it's a sound argument. In other words, if Joe's a citizen of Texas, that means all the citizens of Texas are citizens of the United States. That's what that's saying. So that's a sound argument right there. That's sound right there. That is correct. But I can't come over here and affirm the consequent and prove the antecedent. See, Joe is citizen of the United States. Well, yes, there are a bunch of Joes that are citizens of the United States, but that doesn't prove that all those Joes are citizens of Texas. See? So again, the argument affirming the consequent is a bad argument. It is logically fallacious. Any questions about it? Okay. So that's a common fallacy. You take a good course in logic, you're going to learn that that's a fallacy in reasoning. All right? Right here, here's called a VENN, the Venn diagram. And so right here, citizens of Texas citizens, all of them are inside the big circle of U.S. citizens. But there are other citizens named Joe that are living in Utah and Iowa and other states. And I chose states that are short names to get them on the slide. I didn't want to put Massachusetts or something like that, or California. It's a big, long word. So I just chose these as examples. All right. So there's other ways to become a citizen of the United States other than being a citizen of Texas. See? So that's a Venn diagram. That's usually taught in mathematics. All right. If you have any questions, just stop me and ask them. Okay. Let's look at a second example of affirming the consequent. Remember, that's a logical fallacy. If organic macroevolution, now I believe in macroevolution, that is, God put in the genes of animals variations in the genes. So genetically, horses can have white hair, they can be white, they can be black, they can be brown, and they can be spotted in other colors. But what we have here, that's in the genes. And being white might be an advantage if they live, for instance, in places where there's a lot of snow. It might camouflage them, right? I know out at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, I've been out there several times, and out there at the White Sands, there's a place out there where there's a lot of sand that's just white as snow. The horned toads on that White Sands are white, all right? And near when the white sands stop, there's the rock around there is almost black, real dark brown and almost black. The horned toads that live on that region out there where that is dark or the color of the ground. Now, what's the difference? I think it's just selective breeding due to predators. Predators can see the black ones that are out on the white sands, and they eat them. And the ones that are white, they survive. And the ones that are white that get over on the black rock, they get eaten. And so the ones that are on the black are dark colored. Does that make sense? And God put it in the genes to have all those colors just for that survival purpose. That's the wisdom of God. So if organic evolution, macroevolution is true, this is an atheist argument, then there should be similarities in anatomies of various animals. Well, all right, that is true. I would agree that's true. Okay, there ought to be similarities because they evolved from one another. And then they argue there are similarities. Well, what have they done? Tell me what fallacy they've committed. What fallacy? Someone help me. We just covered it. It's on the top of the screen. Okay. They have the consequent. Did you see? That's one of their arguments. And that's one of the arguments they use with the young people in school. All right. And the teachers that are using it probably don't know any better. They're just irrational. Okay. So right here, that doesn't prove a thing about organic macroevolution. Now, if organic macroevolution is true, then the anatomies would be similar, and they're similar. Therefore, it's true. That doesn't prove it. It's a logical fallacy. Now, what I ask you then? I want to ask you this. Another error in this argument, not only is it a logical fallacy, it doesn't prove anything, but they fail to recognize or admit, and they may recognize and not admit it, that creation also postulates that there should be similarities in the anatomies of various animals. Well, why? Well, the one that designed, that is God, who would use the most efficient design for each animal, and that design would often be the same basic design. Blood is pumped by heart, okay? So what do? He's going to build a circulatory system for all of these animals. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to have a skeletal system. Now, why would God make the bones of the animals the shape of the bones? Well, they're strongest. Why are the bones hollow? You know, you'd think they'd be stronger if they were solid. Yes, they would. But for the amount of material in the bone, if you make the bone solid, then you have a lot more weight. But if you make the bone hollow, a cylinder is stronger than with the same amount of material in it than a solid rod, right? And it's stronger. It supports weight. It's weight bearing. It does a better job. I tell you, God is a super engineer. Okay, He engineered the body to work right. Now, what about the bones of birds? Now, they don't need to be heavy because they fly, so their bones are hollow. Again, that hollow bone gives them lightweight, but it still has a lot of strength. And so the shape, the geometric shape of the bones is designed by God. And so right here, the one designer, notice I put one in designer in capital letters. That means I'm talking about God. He used the most effective design for each animal. The design was often the same basic design. So I would argue that God, it's reasonable for creation that God would have the same design for various things. Circulatory systems, muscle systems, and so forth. All of those things, you would see them, basic skeletal systems and so forth. Any questions or comments? So again, I could make the same argument with respect to creation. But again, I won't make that kind of argument because it affirms the consequent. And I argue this, it's reasonable that God would use the same basic design a lot of times, a large number of times. Any questions? Let's take our third example of this fallacy. If microevolution is true, some organs should have vestigial organs, some organisms. Now, what's a vestigial organ? Well, a vestigial organ is a vestige of what they used to have, but when they evolved, they don't use it anymore, right? So we're supposed to have these organs that we used to have before we evolved, and we had them when we were a different animal, right? Some organisms have vestigial organs. That's the argument that's made, right? But I want you to notice here, what are they doing? They're affirming the consequent. It doesn't prove anything. The argument doesn't prove anything. Organic microevolution is true. That's not true. They haven't proven it by this. Now, here's a website. You can go to that website. You can write it down, go to it. But this is a website that makes that argument. It's on a website. That's their argument. Any questions? Third example. Let me back up a minute here. We're going to look at these vestigial organs in just a little bit, okay? A little more detail. One particular problem with this whole argument, besides the fact that it contains the logical fallacy of affirming the consequent, is that as time goes by, more and more of these supposedly vestigial organs have been found to be functional. You know, one time they thought your thyroid gland was a vestigial organ. Huh. Interesting, isn't it? You take a man's thyroid glands out, and he has trouble. And it does a lot of things for your body. An embryologist named Haeckel, I think it was German, proposed the idea of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which means that the evolutionary history, phylogeny, of a species indicated by the developmental stages ontogeny that it passes through. That is, from the time of the conception to the birth, it goes through all these stages that it went through evolution. That was his theory. And so here's what he did. And these will be in your biology books. You see, they call it the gill slits, and that's the claim that that's what they are. Then they lose the gill slits, and I guess they still got them over here, but they still got them here. They either grow a tail here, so they got a tail. Then they go into like a tadpole, and then they turn into these other things, and they look like a bird. So they take all these animals here, and they got the fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, rabbit, and the man. They all kind of look a lot alike, don't they, in a lot of senses? And so they say, well, it must be that we all evolved from the same thing. Well, they don't even know that these are gill slits to begin with, but they go through this all. Now, what's the problem with this? In the course of development from a zygote into an adult, the various embryonic stages are thought to represent the various ancestral stages of that species. In the development of a frog, the tadpole stage almost resembles a fish, indicating the fish ancestry. So the frog came out of a fish because they go through the tadpole stage. Okay? If organic macroevolution is true, then animals should go through the same developmental stages in their development. This is their argument. Then they say, well, they go through the same developmental stages in their development because of these, looking at these stages through the embryo, right? Conclusion, organic macroevolution is true. That's their argument. Again, what's the problem with it? It affirms consequent. It's a logical fallacy. Now, Haeckel was disciplined by scientists during his lifetime, by the scientific community, because these drawings he had were falsified. What did I say? These drawings were what? Help me.
Falsified.
They were falsified. That's on the internet. You can find that. You can find that in science books. All right. He falsified these drawings. But you know what? His drawings are still in the books. What does that tell you? That is amazing. I think it's amazing. It tells me somebody's not honest. All right. The claim that these creases are gill slits is just an assumption. It did kind of look like gill slits, but that doesn't mean they are. Could have other reasons. Stephen Jay Gould admitted that they were falsified. And here's the source where he, in the journal Natural History, March 2000, pages 42 through 49. And he argued that his distortions do not help Darwin. They actually are bad for it because it shows dishonesty. So this is an atheist, Stephen Jay Gould, S.J. Gould. He's dead now. He's not an atheist anymore. I think he's dead, okay? About 5 seconds after you die, you're not an atheist anymore. I guarantee you that, okay? All right, any questions? Modern 21st century textbook writers still use Ernst Haeckel's drawings. Why? I tell you, because it helps them to convince the kids. That's why. And it's dishonest. And if they're dishonest, that tells me something about their other arguments. They might be dishonest in other areas. You need to take what they say with a grain of salt. They're either dishonest in using the drawings, or they're ignorant of their falsification. If they're dishonest, they're unworthy to speak on this issue. Shouldn't be talking, they're dishonest. If they're ignorant, they're unqualified to speak on this issue. Either way, they're either unworthy or unqualified to speak. Shouldn't be writing books. Do you have any questions? Now, I'm being pretty blunt here, but I get so irritated with these people. All right, any questions? All right. Now, here's supposedly vestigial organs. We're supposed to have a tailbone in a human being, all right? But in fact, this right here helps us to sit up straight. Okay, it has a purpose. What about these membrane in your eyes? All right, and in the ape, okay, the ape and the human. So right there, supposedly that's ape ancestry. See, well, if you find a purpose for this membrane, it is not necessarily vestigial. That's my point. chest hair on a man is supposed to be vestigial. But there could be purposes of chest hair. Let me give you something. The fact that I don't know that there are purposes doesn't mean they're not purposes. That just means I'm ignorant. Again, what you're doing is you're arguing from basically, if Marion knows there's a purpose for chest hairs, then there's a purpose. Well, that's true. Marion does not know a purpose of chest hairs. Therefore, there's no purpose. What fallacy has been committed by that argument? Tell me, somebody, help me. See if you learned anything from last week's lesson. If Marion knows a purpose for chest hairs, then there's a purpose. Marion does not know a purpose. What fallacy did I just commit? What? I denied the antecedent. See? The fact that I may not know the purpose for chest hairs doesn't mean there's not one. Now, let me give you a possibility for purpose of chest hairs. I'm not saying I know the purpose, but I will tell you this, that the hair on the human body does more than just be there for viewing or for beauty. A nice head of hair, most older men would like to have a good head of hair. But right here, the hair on your body, you can take a human hair, and if they've got lead poisoning, you can find lead in that hair. Now, what's that telling you? If there's lead in the hair, what is it telling you is happening? The hair is pulling lead out of your body, okay? If you have arsenic poisoning, they can measure the arsenic in your hair. What's happening? The arsenic is doing what? Your body's getting rid of that arsenic by putting it out in the hair. I don't know that that's one of the purposes for hair, but I'm telling you, I know it pulls toxins out of your body. Lead and arsenic both are pulled out of your body, and they can be measured in the hair. If a person is poisoned with arsenic poisoning, someone murders them, they can measure their hair and look at their hair and see when they start getting poisoned. If the hair is long enough, they can actually measure it. They can go into the hair and see how much where the arsenic began to be put in the body. All right. So I set that forth as a potential, as a possible purpose of hair. There may be other purposes. I don't know what they are, but I know in the wintertime, when it gets cold, I let my hair grow longer on my head. I don't get long hair, but I cut it off shorter in the summer. And I just got a haircut and I had it cut short this time, but next time it'll be a medium cut. Because the more hair on the head, it stays warmer. So that may be another purpose. I don't know. And I know the hair will will stop sunlight from blistering the top of my head and give me trouble with that too. So anyhow, are there questions? Marion doesn't know the purpose of hair. That doesn't mean there's not a purpose. That just means Marion's ignorant. What about wisdom teeth? All right. Well, the wisdom teeth may have a purpose. We may have used it, and we may use it in harder food to grind up and to eat for eating purposes. The fact that they don't know the purpose of it doesn't mean there wasn't one. Some people's ears can actually move. All right. They can wiggle their ears a little bit. There may be a purpose in that. What about your colon? Your appendix, that's one of the things that they had as a vestigial organ. You know that General Eisenhower, during World War II, he went in the hospital and had his appendix taken out because he'd had a little bit of trouble, and he was afraid he would have to have it taken out while he was overseas getting ready for D-Day. Did y'all know that? Why?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they thought it was vestigial. So he had it taken out so he wouldn't have trouble with it during that time. Well, now what they found is that this organ, which has blood in it and everything, it still seems to be useful. It's a storage sac for good bacteria to put back into your intestinal tract. It stores good bacteria, dumps it back into your intestines for your intestines to work after you get sick. So lo and behold, it has a purpose. Okay, it's not vestigial. Sorry about that. Any questions? The list of vestigial, and I told you earlier that they thought the thyroid was vestigial. Okay. Well, boy, it's far from vestigial after they studied it more. As the list of vestigial organs shrinks and they keep finding purposes for them, this argument becomes more and more less effective. Okay. Even with people who are uneducated, after a while, people can see through it. But this is an argument they've been making, but it contained a logical fallacy to begin with. Are there questions? Over time, my prediction is that scientists, if they study far enough, they'll probably find a purpose for each of these so-called vestigial organs. I think the list of them is down to 5 or 6 or 7 now that they have claim are vestigial. They're almost down to nothing. Okay. But this argument used to be a big argument that the atheists made. But even if they don't find a purpose, it doesn't mean that there's not one that exists. There's not a purpose. It just means we're ignorant. Hey, I admit I'm ignorant, okay? I just don't know. Ignorant doesn't mean stupid. I may be stupid too. But I'll tell you, the fact that I don't know something doesn't mean somebody doesn't know it, okay? All right, any questions? All right. Now, let's look at our 5th example of affirming the consequent. If organic microevolution is true, then animals in isolated areas should have similar characteristics. Well, that's true. I would agree with that. All right. Animals in isolated areas have similar characteristics. Well, they're affirming the consequent. Therefore, they conclude organic microevolution is true. Well, the problem with that is with microevolution, which is allowed by creation, because God gave the genes to allow us to have various variations in our bodies. We have all different. Humans are all descendants of 2 people, and we have black skin, brown skin, kind of a yellowish skin. We have what is called white, but it's kind of a tan or light brown skin, and we have blue eyes, brown eyes, and almost black eyes. We have different hair colors and all kinds of stuff like that. And yet we're all descendants from the same one. Look, that's a lot of variations in the genetics. Just genetic variation. We're all cousins, okay? But look at all these variations we have just in humans, right? If organic microevolution is true, then the biochemical mechanisms used in organisms should be similar. Well, the organisms by which it digests food and by which, well, that would be true. The biochemical mechanisms are similar. Well, that's true, but they affirm the consequent. If creation is true, God could have used the same mechanism, same basic mechanism for biochemical mechanisms, digesting food, assimilating food, taking in oxygen, water, and so forth, all of that. So the Creator God could have used the same mechanism. That's pretty reasonable. He would use the most efficient system. He'd design it. He'd just use it over and over with variations. So it doesn't prove anything. I could make that same argument for God. Right? Again, but it's a fallacious argument to begin with. Any comments? Example 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6 are found in the following website. Right there. I just answered a website. Okay. You can go to that website now. If you're looking at this on the internet, all you got to do is pause it and look at this and write this down, go to that website, and lo and behold, you can find all those arguments. I just answered them. I answered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments that are on that website. And they're all fallacious. They're all unsound arguments. Every one of them could be made for creation. Right. Now, after the flood, here's my possible explanation. I'm not claiming it's a definite certainty. After the flood, God could have sent the animals, for instance, the marsupials, to these isolated regions for some unknown to us reason. I don't know. God could have done it. And he could have had a reason that we don't understand. I don't know the mind of an infinite creator unless he tells me. And so I may reason and see some reasons for what God did, in my mind, I may even be wrong with my conclusions, but God sent the animals into the ark. We know that. The scriptures tell us that. We get that in Genesis. Noah didn't go rustle them up. They were sent in to him. So God sent the animals into the ark that he wanted to survive. Now let's look at dogs, the kind called dogs, canines. We have canines that are big like a Afghanistan wolfhound or a St. Bernard, and we have them very tiny like a Chihuahua. And they're all dogs. Now, what did God send onto the ark? He sent a pair of dogs that had the genes for all of these variations in their genes. And these dogs survived as coyotes and foxes and wolves and other dogs, wild dogs in Africa and so forth. They survived as those animals, and they survived, and they had all these different variations. And that's what we see. So God sent them into the ark. Now, where did these animals go? After the ark, they scattered. Well, when they scattered, where all did they go? They covered the whole earth, went over the whole earth. And what variation survived? Well, if you take foxes, and of course that's by name, but if you take foxes, the foxes in Oklahoma are not real large. We have mostly red foxes, but the foxes that are here are fairly tiny. They're not real large, but they're very intelligent. They have to be. The other predators will eat them. So what they are is they're small, and they can handle the weather we have here. Now, in the Arctic region, you go further north, the foxes are larger. A larger animal can survive the cold better than a smaller animal because their body can keep the heat. And so the ears on the Arctic foxes are shorter because a long ear and the heat can come out of the body. And their fur turns white in the winter. Well, that's camouflage, and it doesn't. It's not white in the summer. It turns back a different color. But the foxes in Oklahoma stay the same color all the time. Now, what happened? God had it in the genes of those animals to have that characteristic. The ones that survived in the Arctic region would change their colors and have their ears smaller. Why? Because they can survive better. There are desert foxes in some parts of the world, like in Africa, and their ears are quite large. Well, why would they have large ears? Because they can get rid of heat through those ears. They pump a lot of blood into it, and the heat goes out of their body. The places get very hot. Okay. Any questions? I picked on foxes as an illustration, but God sent the animals in the ark. He could easily have sent the animals to the various places where he wanted them to survive. And as they went into Noah, into the ark, two of all flesh were in his breath of life. They went in. Noah didn't go find them. They went into Noah. Genesis 7:15. Because our young people are subjected to these irrational arguments when they get into higher education institutions, they are subject to being overwhelmed by the status of the professor. Because he is smart. He has this PhD degree. Right? And so they can be overwhelmed. The professor's arguments are not sound just because he cannot answer them. If they're logically invalid, they're not sound at all. And so once we recognize that the argument is invalid, and no, it's not sound. It has to be valid to be sound. If it denies the antecedent or affirms the consequent, it's not sound. It's easy to fall into the trap of our young people to thinking, of even older people, that thinking he must be right because I can't answer him. Well, that doesn't mean a thing. That would only have meaning if you were God, okay? Because God knows everything. I don't know everything. And the fact that I can't answer an argument doesn't mean there's not an answer to it. It just means I haven't studied it thoroughly enough. Now, if it's a matter that relates to my soul, I believe there's an answer to it. and I have to figure it out. But whenever I'm looking at the arguments of the atheists, I say, okay, the answer to most of them is they're logically invalid. They're flawed. They're not sound. Most of them are. In fact, the major arguments of the atheists are all logically unsound. If organic macroevolution is true, then there's no answer to his argument. That's how we think. Well, I don't have an answer, so therefore organic macroevolution must be true. Well, this is invalid. What is the flaw in this argument? What about that? I've affirmed the consequent, haven't I? Here's my if organic evolution, macroevolution is true, that's my antecedent. There is no answer to his argument. That's my consequent. Now, in the what here, there's no answer to his argument. I affirm the consequent. Logical fallacy. Didn't prove a thing. Any questions or comments? There's one instance where the logical fallacy of the prior slide would apply. Yeah, because God's omniscient. If God doesn't have an answer to a question, there's no answer to that question. But we're not talking to God. This atheist professor is not talking to God. Okay? So God's not in the picture here. Since we're not God, we must not commit this fallacy. Don't let this fallacy pull you into disbelief. Look at it carefully and understand. Here, let me illustrate this. If John Doe killed President Kennedy, all right, then John Doe was in Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963. That's true. Now then, I say John Doe was in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. Does that prove that he killed President Kennedy just because he was there? See how foolish that argument is? It's ridiculous. I don't know how many people lived in Dallas at that time, but I suspect there were 500,000 or so, maybe more. It's a pretty large city. I don't know how large it was in 63. I was there in 63 when I went in the Navy in 1963 in August or July of 1963, on the 30th of July when I went in the Navy. But I don't know how big the city was, but I'm sure it was 500,000 people or bigger. So there probably wasn't anyone named John Doe. That's a fictitious name. But make up John Smith. There probably was a John Smith. And so he was there. Now that doesn't prove he killed President Kennedy. See how foolish the argument is? Again, it denies it affirms consequent. It's a logical fallacy. So it doesn't prove a thing. All right? So just because you can't answer an atheist argument doesn't mean there's not an answer. Don't be sucked into that. That's foolish. Any comments or questions? So look at another fallacy. We've done enough on this, affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, these last two lessons. Here's another argument, a fallacy of a straw man. Some logicians group the straw man as some reason as secundum quid, but we won't get into that in more detail. The fallacy is committed frequently in the writings of atheists who attack either the doctrines of special creation or the flood. And you get on the internet and find the arguments that they make. Let me give you an illustration. Here's what the straw man argument is. The fallacy of straw man occurs when the advocates have set up an issue just so they can knock it down. A straw man, I can knock him over because he can't fight back, see. Sometimes they attack a minor argument of their opponents and claim that they have refuted the whole case. Or else they refute an argument their opponents did not advance and claim that they have thus refuted the opponent's position. Now, a young preacher was talking to me one time about debating, and he had 4 or 5 arguments, and they were all good arguments. But one of them had a little bit of a weakness in it. It would be real easy to use it and muddy the water. You know what I told him? I said, use the other arguments, don't use that one. He said, well, why? He said, don't you think so? I said, I sure do. But your opponent can muddy the water with it. He can bring it up and muddy the water, make it look like it's not valid. And he can make people doubt it. And so he'll zero in on that one argument he considers the weakest, and he'll focus on it and won't even address your other arguments. So don't even make it, I told him. Don't make it at all. Make the other 3 or 4 arguments that are strong, that you know he can't answer. Any questions or comments there? Now, if you're writing a book, you can put them all in there. But the problem is, when they evaluate your book, what are they going to do if they're dishonest? They'll zero in on what they think is the weakest argument. That's the straw man. That's what they've done. Now, then, this is in the book Argumentation and Debate. And I took a course out of this book at the college where I taught as a professor. When I was a professor, I'd take a class nearly every semester. And so I just take classes, I'd take them free. I just had to buy the books, so I'd take a class. So I got 9 college majors before I got through, before I finally quit. That's kind of weird. I'm kind of strange, okay? But it was interesting, and I learned this in that book. That was in the book. The straw man is when one misrepresents the opponent's position in order to make it easier to attack, or he attacks a weaker opponent while ignoring a stronger one. Let's deal with the flood now. Let's get into the flood in just a minute. Atheists attacked the flood by setting up a straw man that the flood was caused by 40 days of rainfall. You can go to the websites, arguments, Google, arguments against the biblical flood. And there's several websites. I probably ought to give you my links to them. I'll do that. I'll send you the links to them afterwards, after class. And the websites, if you go to them, you'll find many of their arguments, a bunch of them, a fair percentage of them, argue from 40 days of rainfall causing the flood. Well, the people that argue 40 days of rainfall causing the flood hadn't read the Bible very carefully at all. And so they other explanations of the flood in their attacks on the veracity of the scriptural record of the flood. But this is their straw man, 40 days of rainfall. All right. Now, we get into other arguments. Another error that people make is called circular reasoning. A circular argument is going in a circle, see, also called begging the question or circular definition, is an assertion merely restated in slightly different terms. Here's an illustration of it. Boxing is a dangerous sport because it's unsafe. Here, unsafe conveys the same idea as dangerous. So it is dangerous because it's unsafe. Well, dangerous and unsafe basically mean the same thing. So he's begging the question. And so it's dangerous because it's unsafe, okay? And so the conclusion is the same basically as the premise, even though he used different words. That's frequently what's done. You got to be careful with that. This is from a handbook used for writers for college grammar composition and English grammar composition. Here's the form of this fallacy. P is true because Q is true. Q is true because R is true. R is true because P is true. Now watch what we do here now. P because of R, because of Q. Q because of R because of P. P goes back to the beginning. You're going in a circle here, back to P, P, Q, R, P, Q, R. Just go right back around the circle. And the problem with this is P is true because Q is true. Then Q is true because R is true. R is true because P is true. You haven't proven anything. You've argued in a circle. It's called circular reasoning. Any questions or comments about that? Now, they may change their terms. They may use synonyms to do this, all right? But they'll do it with synonyms. Here's an argument from it. Organic evolution is true because uniformitarian geology has proven it's true. Well, that sounds good, all right? Then we argue. Uniformitarian geology is true because organic evolution has proven it to be true. Now, okay. The problem is they may have several steps in between here, but whenever you get it, they're going back in a circle called circular reasoning. It doesn't prove anything. And whenever a person argues that way, you got to be suspicious of his integrity. He's either irrational or he's dishonest, one of the two. Atheists lodge arguments against the flood that contain assumptions of uniformitarian geology. Now, we've talked about uniformitarian geology. We've said that the atheist geologists now are rejecting uniformitarianism, right? Strict uniformitarianism. And but yet their arguments that they make against the flood are based upon uniformitarian geology. You can't have it both ways. You can't reject it and then turn around and use it for your arguments. The ages of the fossils are based upon uniformitarianism. Ages of the rocks and so forth are based on uniformitarianism, but they've rejected uniformitarianism. Based on these assumptions, they claim they have disproven the claim that the flood occurred, supposedly proving the only alternative, uniformitarian geology, which they've rejected. To use arguments that they've already rejected themselves. Well, again, they're either dishonest or they're unqualified to be speaking. Since many atheists have supposedly rejected classical uniformitarian geology, are we making a straw man argument to argue against uniformitarian geology? Yes, they are. They're making a straw man argument. We would be making a straw man argument if the geologists did indeed reject all of uniformitarian geology. Now, look here. Are we making Christians, since many atheists supposedly rejected classical uniformitarianism, are we Christians making a straw man argument to argue against uniformitarian geology? If they had rejected it and weren't using uniformitarian arguments, we would. But we would be if they weren't using it. But what they're doing is they're using uniformitarian arguments. And so they are, while they've explicitly said they reject strict uniformitarianism, they are using the arguments of uniformitarianism. And so they're the problem. We're not setting up a straw man because they're using uniformitarian arguments. So we're not guilty of it as long as they use uniformitarian arguments, answering them. Atheists are making what I'd call hybrid arguments. I call them hybrid arguments on geological matters. They speak out of both sides of the mouth. That's an English American saying. You're saying two different things and they're opposite. They outwardly reject strict uniformitarianism, but they make arguments that are based on strict uniformitarianism to determine the age of the earth and other factors. So some of the argue for punctuated equilibrium. Now, if we have a punctuation and we put it on a sentence, it ends the sentence. So just think of punctuated equilibrium. What happens, punctuated equilibrium is a theory of evolution, organic macroevolution. What happens, supposedly, there's a sequence of things, and all of a sudden there's a sudden change in things. And so what we see is, to explain the absence of transitional fossils. Organic macroevolution requires that there should be a lot of alligators with feathers. There should be a lot of fish with legs on them in the fossil record because they about to get out on land. We don't have these transitional fossils in the fossil record. So how do they get around this? We don't find them there. They're not there. All right. Supposedly, your reptiles begin to grow feathers. Well, I'm going to get off onto that just slightly. Feathers would be a grave detriment to a reptile. Why? Because reptiles are cold-blooded animals. They're ectotherms. They get their body heat outside their body, ectos in Greek, ectotherms. And so they get their body heat outside their body. If you get the body too hot, a reptile can die. Well, a human can too. But if you get them too hot, they have trouble regulating their body heat. If you put a bunch of feathers on a reptile, he can overheat quickly, or the feathers can keep him from warming up if he's cold, because they form insulation. So feathers on a reptile would be a grave detriment to him, and they just would have trouble living. But well, here we should have them because supposedly birds came from reptiles. Okay, keep that in mind. They came out of reptiles. That's the theory of organic microevolution. So we should have some birds that have. We should have some reptiles that have feathers on them, but we don't. We don't have them. Just they can't find them in the fossil record. So punctuated equilibrium is their method of explaining it. I don't want to go further into it, but supposedly it occurred, it jerks or jumps. Atheists argue for strict uniformitarianism when dating the Earth. They look at the depth of the sedimentary rocks. It took so many years to put an inch of this rock, and they just project that. Well, that's uniformitarianism. Depth sedimentary rocks. Suppose the magnetic field flips, and we get those, supposed. We'll deal with that later. Okay. Other problems. Either the atheist or skeptic is unaware of how to reason properly, make valid logical arguments, or he's dishonest. It's intentionally making unsound arguments to deceive people. If he's unaware of how to reason properly, he's unqualified to speak on it. And of course, if he's dishonest, he's not worthy to be speaking on something. Either way, he shouldn't be speaking on it. Let me summarize, and the lesson will be yours. The logical fallacy of affirming the consequent is frequently committed by atheists and skeptics when they make arguments designed to prove that organic microevolution occurred. And if you recognize it, you can see it pretty quickly. What you want to do is put their argument into an if-then statement. If this is true, then this is true. You can see what they're claiming. And it's real easy to see what they're doing if you just put them in the right form. This reasoning can easily lead a person astray because it shames us for our ignorance. We don't like to admit we're ignorant. I don't like to admit that Marion is ignorant. I don't like it. We don't like to feel like we're ignorant. And we feel like we're admitting ignorance to reject the argument. But we're not. If the argument's based on logical fallacy, don't accept it. Now, I'm going to stop here. Do you have questions? Anybody in the class? Anyone?
Nope.
Get out of it, and we will